Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Emma Gillespie.
I'm Lucy Tassell.
Last week, graphic footage from the assassination of Charlie Kirk went viral online. The 31-year-old conservative political activist was speaking at an outdoor event at Utah Valley University when he was shot in front of thousands of onlookers. Within moments, distressing close-up videos of the incident began circulating widely, flooding social media feeds.
Whether they wanted to see it or not, millions of people around the world have now viewed this footage. The incident has led to renewed discussions about social media platforms' duty of care and the lasting impacts of graphic violence on young people.
Senior lecturer and researcher in psychology at the University of the Sunshine Coast, Dr. Rachael Sharman, has researched this field extensively. She joins us in today's deep dive to discuss the fallout of the Charlie Kirk assassination and the psychological impacts of young people's exposure to violent content online. Dr. Rachael Sharman, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today. We are talking about this viral vision from the Charlie Kirk assassination. This footage became ubiquitous on social media platforms within minutes to hours of the incident. As a child psychology expert, what was your immediate reaction to this footage?
Look, fortunately, I haven't seen the footage, and I've deliberately not seen the footage. I heard it was quite gruesome, and in fact, a number of people suggested one should not see it. And I'm also not really a big fan of, supporting or encouraging this kind of thing. So I've not seen it, but I've heard it is quite disturbing. It's obviously footage of a man being killed. That in itself is disturbing enough, but the fact that I hear, it's somewhat gory, I suppose, and it's in its content. This gets around really quick. And look, this has probably been a problem for adolescents and teenagers in particular for about the last 10 years or so, and it's really not going away. If anything, it seems to be getting worse. This kind of footage appears to be coming up very, very quickly without any real attempts to shut it down. And even if it is shut down, it's just leaked out somewhere else, again, very, very quickly. So I think unless and until we have, I don't know what the answer is from a technological point of view, but better ways of trying to, shut this stuff down, we're going to have to get used to the fact that it exists when these sorts of things happen.
What are the kind of impacts, what is happening in the brain of a young person or a child when they happen upon this footage? Because we know, anecdotally and from the research that often young people are encountering violent, traumatizing, distressing content without even necessarily looking for it. What is that doing to young people?
Yeah, look, you're absolutely right. In fact, a lot of young people report that this stuff gets sent to them from friends. So they actually think it's, some sort of TikTok video about dancing cats or something, and open it up and get, exposed to this most unexpectedly and without their consent. So there's a few different things. If we split the ages up a little bit, so if we talk about pre-teens, so prior to the age of 12, and look, I would certainly hope, no one out there gets access to this footage prior to that age, but this is the world we live in. It's often just downright scary. They really haven't developed the brain capacity to put things into perspective, to understand that this is a rare and unusual risk, that it's not immediate, it's not really pertinent to them. They really don't get that. So they tend to react with fear and anxiety, and they might even do things like sort of start running around the house, locking up doors, not wanting to go shopping, all sorts of things that parents find quite confusing. So that very young brain really does need to be quite protected from this stuff. The kids just don't have the hardware to sort of deal with this at all. The older brain's a bit interesting. So there has been some quite fascinating research looking at adolescents. So if we go now, say 13 and above, and what's been found, so in that context that we know that this typically happens, so a friend sends this on to you, yeah? The difference sometimes is the context in which that friend sent that to you. So if it's with a message like, ha ha, look at this, isn't that funny? Believe it or not, teenagers will kind of respond to that and go, oh yeah, what a joke, and send it. Whereas if someone sends it and says, oh my God, isn't this terrible? Same sort of thing. So we refer to this in psychology as social contagion. So this sort of little ripple effect of how people are responding to this, teenagers in particular will typically mirror that and just copy it. So again, they're sort of, I suppose they're, growing or emerging critical thinking, not quite there yet. And also the ability to sort of say to a peer or a peer group, hey, that's not on or that's terrible, I disagree with you, is really low. Teenagers really want to fit in. We all know that. So they tend to mirror and copy, and hence we get this social contagion effect. So it kind of depends on how that footage was received and in what context in terms of how that individual teenager will respond to it.
Let's say a teenager does receive a link to the footage from a friend who is playing it down or maybe describes it as funny, as you've given that example there, and a young person watches that and feels distressed. What can happen to them in the kind of hours, days or weeks following that? This kind of push and pull between wanting to fit in, but, maybe they're playing this on repeat.
Look, it's a really good question. So what we have found is that, or what research has found in the past, is that this sort of thing does lead to an overall desensitization of these types of images and violence. And again, a teenager's capacity to honestly separate sort of real life from what they're seeing on TV and all the rest of it is still developing. It's still emerging. And certainly, you can see from some of the comments about this particular death, it's like there's an actual person here. Have we all forgotten that? Can we just take a step back, regardless of what you thought about him and all the rest of it? But yeah, that sort of desensitization can unfortunately lead to dehumanization. That is not great. But the group you're then talking about is really the group who are sitting with that discontent, that cognitive dissonance, like, oh, everyone thinks I'm funny, or everyone thinks this is funny, sorry, but I don't. I think this is quite awful, and I can't believe everyone, is laughing about that. And I think, this is where parents, teachers, etc., have a real role. And it's not about telling teens how to think. That's the last thing we want to do. It is about engaging their critical thinking structures. So things like, okay, why is this funny? Why do you think it's funny? Do you think it's okay for these sorts of things to happen? What do you think is going on here? How do you think his family feels? What do you think the community feels about this? And as teenagers start to mull that over, getting them to practice that and sort of, hey, let's look at this from a range of different angles. Let's look at everyone's viewpoint on this. That is a real help, I think, in helping teenagers to move forward through some of this stuff and to make them feel okay about the fact that maybe they have a feeling or an opinion that is different to their peer group about this.
In terms of this kind of generation of young people who are being exposed to distressing content, who are then at risk of that desensitization, ultimately dehumanization, from your perspective as an expert in the field of psychology, what are the lasting effects on, our society more broadly when we're considering that?
Yeah, so there is this lack of, empathy for just your fellow man. And like I said, that dehumanization, when people sort of get cast as a thing rather than a person, oh, this was a conservative, or that person was a snowflake, or that person was, whatever names or labels, people chuck around these days. Once you start doing that, you're not seeing that person as an individual human being with the same human rights as everyone else. So that is one of the effects. We do know from previous research that the impact of that sort of desensitization, particularly as it pertains to violence, does seem to relate to aggression in boys in particular. We don't tend to see it in girls as much in the Western community, so that's America, Europe, UK, Australia, that sort of thing. There are some minor blips there where we can see increases in aggression, and increases in sort of sledging and joking and all that sort of stuff. And look, teenagers do that. So we do have to cut them a bit of slack. But look, there is research to suggest that desensitization, dehumanization does spill over, and particularly when it comes to aggression in males.
We've touched on the ramifications of these videos being shared or coming across the newsfeed of someone without their consent or them looking for it. What about the kind of innate curiosity that we have? I mean, as adults, you and I can make a decision that we don't want to seek this footage out, but that's not the case necessarily in classrooms or at universities with, younger people, children, teens and adolescents. Can you explain a little bit about that curiosity? Is that a natural desire to kind of want to see this?
Hello, Billy here from TDA. We have just looked at our YouTube analytics and 95% of you who are watching our videos aren't subscribing. If you want to help independent media like us grow, the best way you can do that is by pressing subscribe. Thank you so much, and back to the video.
Look, it is. And I mean, if we go past the car crash, there's very few people who don't look, let's be honest. So that is absolutely a natural human thing. And teenagers, young adults in particular, they are curious cats. They are curious creatures. It's one of those things, they don't know what they don't know. They don't know what they're about to see might actually distress them more than they realize and might actually leave a mark. And look, this is nothing new. I've heard from people who, went to see perhaps some sort of mildly gruesome exhibit, an art exhibit or something. And, they thought they'd be fine, and they weren't. They had a panic attack and ran out of the museum, So, this happens, and it's not until you sort of expose yourself to these few things after a while that you realize where your limits are and what you really don't need to see. And you sort of, I'm sure we've all had things we wish we could unsee as we've gotten older in life. So that sort of young teenage, young adult curiosity absolutely is very natural. And look, to be fair, I think we just have to get used to the idea that this sort of stuff is going to become more and more easily accessible. I'm just not aware of how it's going to get shut down easily in society.
Yeah, on that sort of, I suppose, unavoidable exposure that is there online, given that, at the time of recording, if you go on Instagram and type Charlie Kirk, the first thing that you will see is close-up vision of this man's death, essentially. Mm-hmm. What do you want social media platforms to understand from a psychology perspective about the imperative for this footage to be moderated?
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? If we go back in time, let's be, way back before social media even existed, if you wanted to watch a film like Jaws, where a pretend mechanical shark is eating someone, it had to be on at 8:30 at night, and onwards. There were really quite strong rules about what could be published and presented to people. So we've gone from having very strong rules to absolutely nothing at all. What would I say to social media platforms? I don't think they care. I think, unfortunately, the only thing that would work is very, very strict regulation in one way or the other. And I'm sure they'll do their darndest to find their way around it. And until, someone comes crashing down on top of them with a heap of rules and laws and regulations, I just can't see that stopping at all.
Well, I mean, come December here in Australia, under 16-year-olds will be banned from these platforms and won't be able to see vision like this. If Charlie Kirk had been assassinated a few months down the line, maybe we, wouldn't be having this conversation. Do you think that ban is going to work, is going to help young people in this space?
I'll be upfront here and say I have a tremendous bias. Yes, I do. If it was up to me, I'd ban it till 18. And I'd ban the sale of smartphones as well. I'm not silly. I have a smartphone. I work on a computer all day. Of course, people need to be introduced to these things. But it's the same as alcohol as far as I'm concerned. We don't give 12-year-olds and 16-year-olds hard spirits. We wait until we feel that their brain is at least, ready-ish enough to cope with that. And I don't think social media is any different. In fact, a lot of the social media platforms are quite deliberately addictive.
For the rest of us, this content will always be there. We will always be faced with these kind of ethical dilemmas about to click or not to click, to watch or not to watch. How do we balance, staying informed in the world with protecting ourselves from traumatic content? Do you have advice more broadly for, all of us?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, isn't it? So, I mean, as I said, I think we've probably all, once you get to a certain age, we've all seen something we wish we could have unseen. And I think it's just a time, I think it's good to remind yourself of that sometimes. Like, what is the benefit or the advantage of me seeing this? Yes, I'm curious. Oh, look at that. What's happened over there? But what is the advantage here? What's the advantage to me? What's the advantage to society? What's the advantage to Charlie Kirk's family? Like, where's the benefit in this? So, me just wanting to satisfy a bit of sort of natural human curiosity doesn't really outweigh all of those sorts of risks and problems for the society. So, if people just engage their brain and stop and think just for a minute before they click, I think that's the best way to go for adults.
What are some of the signs that teachers, parents, adults who have young people in their lives, what are some of the signs they should be looking out for, given, that this footage has been widely viewed? Are there any kind of particular concern areas or red flags?
Look, funnily enough, one of the big things for kids all through the spectrum, be they younger or older, is imitation. So kids, pretending to shoot each other, kids pretending to take a shot to the head, all sorts of things like that. You could potentially expect that, jokes about it, all that kind of thing. For the younger ones, as I said, fear and anxiety. So suddenly not wanting to go out, suddenly, frightened of certain things, particularly things that might have been evident in the footage. So, I mean, I suppose most kids don't go to a university campus, but, that kind of thing. And a disproportionate fear, like, why are you worried about this? And coming out of nowhere. So that's a big sign for young kids. For older kids, it is more likely to be, as I say, sort of imitation, jokey stuff. Perhaps making jokes about people dying, being a bit more morbid, talking about death, talking about shootings a lot more. It's not necessarily a red flag. It's telling you that the teenager is processing that information. Whether or not they're processing it in a sort of a more adaptive way or a maladaptive way will sort of show up later, I think. So in the first instance, I think parents can just expect to hear a lot about it, as well as teachers, sorry. But in terms of red flags, it's probably that rise in anxiety and possibly even in some boys in particular, a rise in aggression. That's telling you that something's been processed poorly.
And for the rest of us, how do we know if we are having a quote unquote normal or expected response to seeing this kind of distressing vision, or maybe when it's crossed a line into being something more serious that might require a bit more help?
Yeah, great question. So for a lot of adults, that look, people might see this or hear about it and sort of mull over it and think about it and all the rest of it. But at some point you should move on. If people are starting to have nightmares about it, if they are starting to get anxious, and look, I have heard of adults doing this sort of thing, like, I'm not going to go out, I'm not going to go shopping, I'm not going to do this, that, and the other. So similar almost to the younger child reaction, which is interesting. So often we see if adults are sitting out there and let's say they're at a 5 out of 10 anxiety, they're actually coping pretty well, but they do have a bit of bubbling anxiety away. Something like this can trigger it and it can kind of trip it up to, say, an 8 out of 10. Yeah. And so again, that sudden spike in anxiety, particularly about things like in Australia, which we don't, thank goodness, really need to worry about, like gun control or being out in public. If people start worrying about that and taking, again, these disproportionate sort of precautions and reactionary behaviour, that's a bit of a sign that they probably need to go and get their anxiety checked and managed a bit better.
Dr. Rachael Sharman, fascinating to hear your thoughts. Thank you so much for joining us on today's podcast.
Thank you, Emma.